Alright, ladies and gentlemen of the viewing audience, this is a service announcement. We have, at the worst possible time, had yet another sound fuck up. Yes, I'm swearing, but I'm sure you can forgive me for doing so, knowing that this was our final episode of the Long Voyage and the sound went bad. Again. This time I was careful, I sat there, I recorded everything, and I checked everyone's sound levels. I checked everything was, on the recording software, said I am recording everybody. I can hear each voice. Everything was just the way it was supposed to be. And when I sat down, when we were done with this incredible, emotional ending to this campaign that we have loved so dearly, I tried to listen back to it, and I'm the only person on there. This time it wasn't everyone else, and no me. This time it was me, and nobody else. No one in the group has the faintest idea what's going on. However, we have already made a decision that in the future we are going to do some slightly, I won't even say they're lengthy, but we're going to have to do some extra work before every single recording. Namely, we're going to have to do a test recording before every single recording to make sure that things work the way they're supposed to. And we are going to see about the possibility of setting up so that there are multiple people recording the sound. In different locales with their own recording software each in each our place, because this cannot keep happening. So before I get into this recap, which should have been this fantastic ending to a long and fantastic campaign, and I apologize, you have no idea how deeply I regret having to do it this way instead of giving you the actual recordings. Please accept my apologies for this. I know people will probably want to say, oh, but it's nobody's fault, and I'm sure in some way it isn't, but at the same time I can't help but feel responsible for this. I'm the one who's been doing the recording, and it hasn't worked. So on that note, I'm going to give you a recap of how the Long Voyage ended, and I'm going to try to do it justice. So while this is anticlimactic for me, and I'm sure it is for you as well, I hope that you will forgive me for having to do it this way. The game started today with the crew having just joined each other, joined with everyone else who had come on board or come ashore from the invading fleet belonging to the Raven Lady outside of Ayaborg. Ayaborg, of course, being the harbor belonging to the Sword of Strife and to the Phalans, which they had sacked the previous last episode of this second to last episode, I should say, of this campaign. That sacking obviously had been an epic adventure all in itself. But what happened, of course, here was that they had taken some days to recover, to rest and recover. Getting an entire army ashore with all of its gear and all of its provisions and so on and so forth is a pretty lengthy process anyway. And a 10-day had passed, both with a couple of days of organizing on the beachhead, but also clearing out the rest of the meager stretch of coastline controlled by the Sword of Strife. Most of the coastline is controlled by the Raven Lady in the Southlands. Most of the coastline that she doesn't control is controlled by Avold, who is a third and very minor sword who's still alive somewhere in the Southlands. The Sword of Strife only controlled a very small strip of it. However, he controls a great big chunk of the hinterlands, mostly taken up by mountains. So in order for them to make sure that they weren't being attacked in the rear when they marched up into the mountains, they set out to clear out the entire remaining coastline of any Phalan troops or any troops of any kind associated with the Sword of Strife. They did this rather effectively, but one of the things that they then came across was the village that they had also been given the option of actually attacking, namely the the alternate target. They were given a choice, if you recall, of either attacking a the harbor that they did end up attacking, or they could go and take out the food supplies of the enemy army. They chose the harbor. That doesn't mean that the food supply wasn't attacked. It was just attacked by other people. And they came across that village. It was in a sad and sorry state, having been all but obliterated. The Southlanders, at least the Southlanders serving the Raven Lady, have a very harsh policy that says that when you attack an enemy settlement, you kill everyone able to hold a weapon, meaning men and boys of a certain age get butchered, whether they are actually warriors or not. They get slaughtered because otherwise they might take up arms against you in the aftermath. The problem with this, of course, is that it leaves the few survivors completely stunned and deeply resentful, hateful. But it's a fairly effective way of making sure that you're not suddenly facing huge numbers of irregular troops in the rear of your army, which is not something anybody ever wants to have to deal with. But this village that they then came to contained something unwelcome, namely Ylva's estranged family. Ylva's parents had decided to leave Hurborg years before, basically abandoning her when they realized that she was not going to come around. She wanted to be a battle maiden. They didn't approve. They wanted her to marry, and when she basically said screw you and began training to be a battle maiden anyway, they gave up on her, and eventually they abandoned her and went to the Phalans. This was way before the Phalans betrayed the Raven Lady, but it was still obviously a raw wound in Ylva's consciousness. It was a horrible thing to have happened to her. She found her father, who had lost a leg in the fighting. He was still alive, though. She put an end to that. She didn't want him to survive, so they had a very spiteful and angry exchange, and she killed him. Nobody tried to stop her. She had learned from him before he died that one of her 3 siblings, the middle one, a brother named Bjorn, had also been killed, and that her mother had survived, as had her 2 remaining siblings, a little brother called Myr, which means, well, Myr is basically an Old Norse word for someone tiny, and Siri, who was her sister. They were still alive, but not in the village, anywhere in the village. They had escaped the carnage. Black Swede had offered to take a few people and go and find these 2 missing children and bring them back safe. And Ylva did that while she went and found her dead brother, and her mother, who was sitting there holding his hand despite him being dead and having been dead for days. She just completely, her mind had snapped. So Ylva brought her mother out to where her father's body was lying, and then she killed her mother there as well, although a lot less painfully. She made it quick and painless. And then she set out to bury both her brother and the remaining dead in the village that were still just strewn around. It was a horrible place. When that happened, Svidi eventually did bring back, he and a few other crewmen from the Fagerfair did in fact find Svidi's, not Svidi's siblings, obviously. He was the one who went out after them. He found Ylva's siblings and brought them back, and they were at first very frightened, but also at the same time she was a known face and she didn't seem hostile, so they, being small children, sought refuge with her because they were terrified. And in the end, the character of Bagi, whom you may have remembered from the beginning of the campaign, was asked to please bring the children back down to where the fleet was still anchored, where they could be taken care of by the people guarding those ships. After that happened, the characters marched off again to rejoin the army, which they did at the foot of the mountains. There were 2 roads up into the mountains, and they would be splitting. The army would be split in 2, so that there would be no chance of being attacked or outflanked or attacked in the rear again. It was a risky strategy, obviously, but it was one that the Raven Lady felt had to be taken, had to be done. And they had a long evening of reminiscing and looking back on their adventures, getting drunk, that sort of thing, having a good time in general. And well, most of them had a good time anyway. They had some pretty hefty philosophical discussions as the alcohol went in. The kind of drunk philosophy that people tend to do. There were some crass jokes thrown around as well. It was quite touching in many ways, really. It was clear that these characters weren't sure if they were going to survive. They were told that they would be the scouts for their half of the army, so they would be out in front. The very next day they went up into the mountains, and in fact they did come across a small enemy scouting force as well, made up of a warband known as Facebiters. They're cannibals. They're known to be cannibals. And they got into a brief fight with them, which would probably have gotten somewhat more bloody if Ylva had not remembered that she has an ability that she's consistently forgotten to use, namely she can use a war cry. And she did, and it was highly effective at stunning the enemy, which allowed the rest of them to basically just slaughter them at will. Also, Frothy outflanked them in the shape of a direwolf and ripped them to shreds when he got into contact with them. It's a very, very dangerous beast, obviously. And so they survived, and just as Ylva had said, that was easy. They heard a horn blaring, so somebody had clearly seen the fight and had decided to warn someone else further along. And so they crept closer to try to find out what it was, and they realized that when they got up over the crest of the slope that they were standing on, they would be up on a plateau, but still a plateau where they would be fighting uphill. And on the opposite side of this stood the enemy army under the command of the Sword of Strife. And so they went back to their own army and reported this, and the Raven Lady gave the order that the attack would go in, and that it was meant to be a holding attack. They were meant to attack the enemy, occupy them for as long as it took for the other half of her army to catch up and slam into the flank of the enemy and roll up their entire formation. That was what the plan was, and Captain Ormer went around to all of his crewmen and spoke to each of them and wished them all good luck. And he ended up saying to all of them, when we set out to do this, I said that all I could promise you was adventure, and that for me that was easily enough. But there is so much of the world we haven't seen yet. There are the Northern Isles. You can't get further away than the Northern Isles. I want to see them. Who here doesn't want to see this place? And while we were in Tethmem, I heard of these amazing cities of stone built in a sea of sand. I want to see places like that. Who wouldn't? Would you go with me? He asked his whole crew. Would you go with me to see these places? And of course they all confirmed that they would, that yes, they would in fact be with him. And he did ask them, are you with me? And they all said yes. And then he threw away his cloak, and it billowed down over the side of the hill. this orange and white striped cloak of Hirborg. And he said, as long as we remain, Hirborg isn't destroyed, because we are what remains of it. And then he turned around and charged up over the crest of the hill as the first man and into the teeth of the enemy army. And that's where we stopped, being followed by everyone else in the army. And that's where we stopped. I wish you could have heard us play that. It was beautiful. The players did remarkably well. As always, they're great players. I'm sorry that it has to be done with yet another one of these damned recaps. But, as I said at the end of that particular one, we are now coming up on Copenhagen Dreaming as our next campaign, another World of Darkness campaign, and I hope you will be with us for that. And when we start that up, we will have it will be some weeks before we can get started on it. And in the meantime, I give you my word, I promise, we are going to figure out some way or other to avoid this happening again, with this suddenly not, the sound suddenly not getting recorded, either from me or from the players, and it's just, it makes no sense whatsoever. We're going to find some kind of solution for it. So please bear with us, and please forgive us for this one, and I hope we'll see you for the next campaign as well. Thank you very much for having followed the Long Voyage, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have enjoyed playing it. Bye for now.